All right. Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. If this is your first event of the day, then welcome. If you caught an earlier event today, then welcome back. Thank you all for joining us at Startup Boston Week. So on my screen, one second. So on my screen, you'll see the sessions that are currently happening right now. So you actually logged in to watch Great Expectations, Exploring Challenges and Opportunities for Female Entrepreneurs in Boston. So if you did hope to catch one of the other sessions, please click on Agenda top left and click Join to join the correct session. Okay. Now, my name is James Coe. I'm one of the organizers for this event. And a couple of things to go through. On the right side of your screen, I'm going to point out a couple of tabs. The first is the chat tab. Feel free to use that tab to share any thoughts or comments about the event or engage with fellow attendees. Introduce yourself on the chat, share where you're logging in from. I had someone that logged in from India earlier on today and someone from Hawaii. Share a link to your LinkedIn profile. But if you have any questions for the panel, please use the Q&A tab on the far right of the screen. And that'll submit the questions to the moderator and make it easier for her to see the questions and get it answered. And this conference is all about learning, so we definitely encourage you to ask questions. Now with that, I'm going to hand the stage over to the moderator, Marie Meslin. Marie, it's all yours.
Thanks, James. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. We are very, very happy to be here to talk about something that's, kind of dear to all of us. The subject of exploring challenges and opportunities for female entrepreneurs in Boston, but also beyond. We're going to be talking a little bit about what's going on, not just here, but also in the country, just to give us a sense of, what is happening on a larger scale and what lessons we might want to learn from that as well. So I'm extremely excited to be here. As James said, please use the chat. That's what it's there for. Say hi, introduce yourself, say what you're working on. But if you do have a question, it's the Q&A functions. So please use that if you want to interact with any of the speakers today. That's what we're here for, right? We're here to answer questions. We're here to help you. We're here to support you. This is really what it's all about. So very excited to be here. The way that we're going to run this is going to be, hopefully in more of a free flow form kind of conversation. I'm going to ask Banu to set the stage, and I'll have everybody introduce themselves in just a little bit. So we're going to set the stage a little bit for you to give you some insight, like I said, about what's going on in terms of data and in terms of trends and things like that, so that we can get a little bit of our bearings in terms of understanding what we're actually talking about today. Then it's going to be a little bit more of a free flow conversation. We have some fantastic, amazing, incredible speakers today. And I'll have them introduce themselves in just a little second. But I wanted to say hello. My name is Marie. And I'm actually the executive director and president of a nonprofit that's based in Boston called the Capital Network. And we are a nonprofit that teaches entrepreneurs about the fundraising process. So we focus exclusively on helping first-time and early-stage entrepreneurs understand how to get their first outside capital, whatever that might look like. But we are here today, or I'm here today, because in 2016, I created a program called the Fellowship for Female Founders. And that is a program, a 6-month program, specifically designed for female founders to help support them in their journey to fundraising. It won't come to any surprise to any of you as why we started a program like this, and it's grown exponentially in the last few years. And so that's kind of some of the perspectives that we have here to bring to the table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And as I often do in events like this, we're not just talking about data, we're talking about building relationships, right? And so the way you do that is by getting to know people on a slightly different level. So I'm going to ask all of you to introduce yourselves and share something that brings you joy with everybody here. So Banu, I'll have you go last, since you're going to be doing a little bit of a presentation in terms of kind of setting the scene. So I'm going to start with Ali. Ali, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marie. I appreciate it. So Ali Forsyth, co-founder and CEO of Alloy Enterprises. At Alloy, we're developing a novel additive manufacturing technology specifically for aluminum. So our customers are manufacturers who are looking to use aluminum to lightweight vehicles and reduce carbon emissions. So I've been a serial entrepreneur in the startup ecosystem here in Boston for about the last 12 years since I finished my PhD. Technical background, I'm an engineer by training, but this is my first time around as a CEO. So excited to be on the panel today with a great group here, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks. Maybe Bonu, pass it over to you.
I will go next. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Revenuebased Pan. I'm a professor in the practice of engineering at Brown University. I'm the founder and director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab, where we look at research and try to put together best practices around inclusion in the venture capital industry, as well as advocate for inclusive policies that can foster a responsible and inclusive innovation ecosystem for startups beyond. I have been working with Marie and Lisa for a while now, so it's really good to be back together as we put together more information and conversation series on how to create inclusion in Boston and beyond. What brings me joy is my new puppy, who is keeping me awake, but also filling me with lots of energy and hope. And I apologize if you hear her in the background.
That'll bring some of us joy as well, the dog lovers in the room. Lisa, how about you?
Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled that this panel is part of Startup Boston. I am Lisa Frühsteier, and my background is in technology. And over the last several years, I've been focusing on investing across the full spectrum of investment options, from direct investments to investing through funds, through revenue-based financing. I am really excited to be investor in residence at the Capital Network. So I get to work with Marie and Banu. I'm involved in several other funds. I'm a lead partner on the Portfolio Enterprise Fund, which focuses mainly on technology. I just got involved in Third Culture Capital, which is Boston-based. I'm involved with an accelerator. And the theme that ties all of those disparate things together is how to channel capital to underrepresented founders. I take every opportunity to talk about that, whether it's on the agenda or not. In terms of what brings me joy, I love this time of year, and I can't wait to go apple picking.
Fantastic. Okay. So what we wanted to do for everybody here is to set the scene a little bit. So we asked Banu to put a few things together just to give us a sense of what's going on for female founders and for investment with female founders locally and nationally. So Banu, I'll hand it to you right back. What is going on? Like, we've heard lots of numbers, we've heard lots of moments by looking at this. So what do you have to tell us?
I'll give you some numbers, and then we'll add a little bit of nuance to those numbers. So nationally, if you go to American Express, they put out an annual survey of business owners specifically focusing on women. And between 2014 and 2019, all businesses grew at a rate of about 9%, whereas women-owned businesses grew 21%. But if you look at women-owned businesses from women of color, it grew double at that rate at 43%. And the fastest growing area was for Black women. So we know that Black women are starting businesses at disproportionately higher rates than anyone else, but also other women. One of the things that's a little bit concerning is that their disparity between minority and non-minority women when it comes to revenue is actually increasing. So for minority women, the average revenue is about $65,800, whereas for white women, that revenue, the average revenue for women-owned business is $218,800. And so if we were to reach parity, if women of color reach parity with white women, we would actually add about $1.4 trillion in revenue, which would have an absolutely huge impact on the economy. And it also has a disproportionate effect on the U.S. economy, this growing disparity between women-owned businesses and between women of color versus white women. Now, when you compare women in general to male founders, you also see this disparity sort of continue to exist despite a lot of commitments to diversity and inclusion on the founder side. So what we've seen is the emergence of a lot of diversity pledges, certificates, and commitments to fund women. But what we haven't seen is the actual funding come close to what male founders are getting. We still see a pretty large gap in terms of what women-led firms are getting. They tend to hover between 3 to 5%, depending on which stats you're looking at. So in terms of the disproportionate numbers of women starting businesses, we're not seeing them translate into the funding that they should be getting based on sort of just numbers alone. So there's definitely some barriers that continue to exist. Although overall, I would say there's a lot more awareness and conscientiousness around the importance and sort of economic value of inclusion and sort of funding folks who are coming to the startup world from different backgrounds than the ones that have traditionally received funding. I'll pause there. I have a lot more data I can share, but the nuance of it is, I think it is not something that folks are shying away from in terms of talking about it and examining. It's definitely, I would say, out there, and it's not going to go away.
Bonnie, just to expand on that just a little bit, can you give us a sense of, you're talking about pledges, you're talking about people who are looking to create, at least say that they want to create some change. Are we talking about the last year, the last 2 years? I mean, how big of a movement is this? And
that's a great question.
How early can we start potentially seeing some results?
How can we be hopeful and when? So when I did a lot of my research in 2017, somewhat into 2018, I was still hearing a lot of a rising tide will lift all boats. There's really no reason to specifically focus on a particular type of entrepreneur, whether it's by race or gender. And what has happened in the last 3, maybe 2 years, dramatically after Me Too and after Black Lives Matter, is a dramatic change in sort of the rhetoric of people who believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think the recognition is not everybody has a boat, and that the tide is, rising exponentially fast for some people and not others. So what has happened in the last 2-3 years, so very recently, is a sense that there needs to be some consideration of the fact that the system in general works well for certain types of entrepreneurs and not so much for others. And in Boston, I can give you some stats. From 2012 to about 2016 is where the latest stats are. I have to run the numbers for 2021. With the pandemic, it's a little off. The rate of women-owned businesses went from 29% to maybe 34%. So not a huge increase. In fact, a slow and steady creep. Whereas in other ecosystems like St. Louis, which is emerging and a lot more robust and dynamic, it went from 28 to almost 50% in the same amount of time. So there's certainly things we can be doing in Boston. And I think we're here to talk about what those things are today.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that, I think leads us straight into asking you some questions, Lisa. You're an investor. You work, very closely with many, many female founders, most of which are based in Boston. What are you seeing on the ground? I know you spent, basically the whole summer interviewing founder after founder after founder, through all the interviews that you've been running. Tell me a little bit about what Bonnie was saying. What does that look like actually on the ground when you're talking to founders? What are they seeing? What are they feeling? What's going on?
It's a great question. And I just want to start with 2 observations. One is, yes, I have been interviewing a lot of female founders because I'm really, really interested in what drives them internally. And I actually am trained as a coach. So the reason I'm saying that is that I am providing a composite. The confidentiality of these conversations is really, really important. So, just as when you read a work of fiction, any resemblance to actual incidents, names, people, companies is purely coincidental. So this is the trend. But having said that, there are a couple things that I see. One is a little bit discouraging, and the other is encouraging and points to what we can do. When we talk about lack of confidence, what does that mean? Like when you talk to somebody, how does that play out? And it's things like people a little bit hesitant to trust their gut. They actually know what feels right to them. They actually have in mind the profile of the investor who they want to find and with whom they want to partner, but they're second guessing themselves and trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do? Well, in the world of entrepreneurship, there are very few supposed to do's. You get to create it yourself. And so that's one thing. A second thing is women sometimes feeling as though they need more evidence for success before they can go out and give a pitch or ask for money. So again, it's a little bit of a variation on, okay, what's somebody else looking for? What is the right answer? And really vetting things. Now that, you know, if you think about it, should make women more attractive as investments because they're very well prepared, very thorough. I mean, all the data shows that the return on investing in women is higher than investing in other kinds of companies not run by women. But that's how I'm seeing this confidence issue play out. It's the second guessing, it's the vetting and revetting. It's getting a lot of feedback. And think about how much time that occupies and how much mental energy that occupies. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news is I'm seeing women really, really responsive to champions. And very often, those champions are men. I talk to a lot of men who are really interested in supporting women, but ask me how. How do I get connected with networks of women? What do I do? And almost so far of the people who I've talked to, of the female founders I've talked to, virtually all of them have a male champion, whether it's a mentor or an investor or a spouse. So I believe that women respond to that, but that also opens the door for men to become that champion.
So you're talking about confidence. So there's a few things at play, right? I mean, we're talking about there's a problem, there's clearly an issue with getting money to women. Now, there are some things that we could be doing to support more women based on some of the things that, you know, you've seen, Lisa, or we've seen in our programming, which is creating a support system that looks different from what we've traditionally had, right? And that a lot of times can be through mentorship, through confidence building, through leadership coaching, through all of those things that may or may not be part of the support system that we have now. So that's great. But on the investor side, you know, what's going on there too? You're talking about you know a lot of people who want to support women, right? So how do we make that jump from the wanting to the doing? That's one of the things we're interested in. And I know obviously this won't come to a shock to many people who are with us today, is that there's always a lot of emphasis put on what women should do and how they should change. There's also a lot of emphasis around how there's a structural problem, that the way that investment is designed isn't there to really support, different kinds of founders. And then there's also just, this kind of newer awareness that investors have that, oh, no, these could be really good investments, right? This kind of new idea that this should be economically, but also the right thing to do. But obviously, as Banu said, this is an economic thing, right? Like you need to invest in women and founders of color because the returns are there. And if you don't, you're missing out on, a massive opportunity, trillions, right? Just when you're talking about women, it's trillions of dollars. So what are some, and I think we can kind of get into all of these different segments. There's obviously a lot to talk about. So the first thing I would love to ask Lisa before I ask Ali a couple of questions is, from the investor perspective, what are some of the things that, you see that might be helpful and that we can all do to figure out how to continue that conversation and help investors move, like past that threshold, just say, I want to, but actually doing it? How do we get people to the doing portion?
First of all, there are a lot of structures that work very differently from traditional equity funding. And it's a win-win because it helps bring new kinds of investors, new majority founders into the fold, and it helps encourage funding to women. But it's also a good thing for investors to explore things like revenue-based financing or debt financing. Not every company is really a fit for traditional equity financing. And I believe that that is a two-way education, both on the part of investors. I was talking to somebody just the other day who really loves the idea of revenue-based financing, but believes that it's much harder and much more complicated. Well, is it? I think that we need to really examine our own preconceptions as investors and get creative. The other thing is, maybe it is shorter term infusions of capital that's milestone based funding rather than, there's a lot of sort of theater in the traditional VC model where there's a pitch and a competition and a very, a very sort of uh, defined raise. And why does it always have to play out that way? If you like the idea, you want to encourage the founder, I think it's incumbent on people on both sides of the table to get much more creative about the way that we're channeling capital.
So Ali, based on your experience, I mean, you said you've been part of startups for a long time. You are a first-time founder though, and are, we're raising, based on what Banu was saying and Lisa was saying, like, what's your experience been like as you've been raising money for your own startup?
Yeah, great question, Marie. So, and just to add to one of Lisa's sort of last comments there, I'd also encourage all the founders out there to be pursuing grants as a funding opportunity. That's something I've been able to leverage both at Alloy and before, NSF's SBIR program, DOE, and, sort of beyond. There's many Massachusetts organizations now that provide very early stage funding that's non-dilutive for founders. And so I've had a lot of success with that. Lots of lessons learned and hard lessons learned. I think making sure that you find your champion, someone who will sponsor you rather than just mentor you. Certainly in the fundraising, life cycle, there's a lot to learn about the process. There is a lot that's theater, finding out what the patterns are so that you can assess and figure out how, your story fits into that or doesn't fit into that, I think is critical. But what you're really looking for, I think, as a founder, when before you even start fundraising and you're just doing your initial networking and getting connections to those, key investors that you've highlighted, you're looking for that person that, on the phone or on Zoom just opens up their digital Rolodex to you and says, this is who I know, and lists off 12 people and says, follow up with me and I'll help make some connections to the best investors. So I think getting your name out there, talking to potential champions, you're looking for former entrepreneurs that have been successful or angel investors, sometimes people in your ecosystem that just are a little further along in their career, and really looking for and pushing to find those champions that will really help you, whether it's reviewing your deck, helping you understand the patterns and how fundraising works and what might be the best model for you, but also just making those connections for you, I think is a really key. I think a lot of times as women, and myself specifically, I've pushed for mentorship and feedback and get sometimes into a feedback loop when in reality, my pitch is fine. I just need to get out there and get to the right people.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings me to not all of us obviously have access to high net worth individuals. Not all of us have access to even an ecosystem. Obviously, right now we're in Boston and we're talking about Boston, but I'm kind of looking for ways. What are the ways that we can support women founders who may not have access to all of those things, right? So what are some of the structures or the support systems that we can put in place to make sure that we have more women who are able to even get to the stage where they can talk to other founders or talk to investors. Banu, Lisa, and Ali, this is open for everyone. What are some of the things that as a community, as an organization, we're missing? I mean, we've got thousands of accelerators, right? And to Lisa's point, things are fairly structured, right? There's a whole series of programs that you go through. There's a pitch event that you attend, and then you network with people, but that doesn't always work for everyone, right? And there's the confidence piece, there's the leadership piece, but there's also a whole structure that we're not doing right now. We're not doing well enough to make sure that we bring more women to the table. What are some of the things that we could be doing as a community to really support more founders where they are at, to help them where they want to go?
I have a thought about that, which is that to the extent that we're able to educate women on capital and the capital markets in general, and increase the number of female investors, that can be enormously effective. I saw a statistic that said that women are twice as likely to get funding if there's a female VC decision maker, but that's just in the world of VC. Across the entire capital markets, there are opportunities. And, there are organizations like, for example, Invest for Better, which is a nationwide network designed to educate women on how to align their investments with their values. And just jumping in, I mean, I think that very often we look at the macroeconomic trends and the statistics, but so much of the world of funding is network driven. So it's individual by individual. And if you are interested, just get out there and start talking with people, whether it's your colleagues, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends. And I believe that knowledge, which very often, the world of funding and capital markets comes across as very opaque, but it's not. I mean, we can all become investors. So I really believe a lot of it is by pulling those levers you get access to, whether they're big levers or small levers.
I can go next. It's been really interesting to kind of look both across the US, but also globally at what's being done and where and how. And you could sort of segment it into different, I would say, levels, right? So institutionally, there are countries that have potential quotas or requirements of their investors that have a certain amount or percentage of their portfolio being led into female-founded firms. There are sort of meso-level organizational things that we could be thinking about and doing where we don't bifurcate or create parallel tracks for women by having a female-only event or an event where those allies that need to show up can't or don't show up, so that you end up creating separate and unequal tracks for women in the ecosystem across the differences that women have, their intersectional differences. So one of the things that tends to work is from the side of leaders in the ecosystem who are either previous founders or organizational leaders that are leading co-working spaces, programs, networks, accelerators, and so forth, is to normalize the diversity so that everyone feels welcome at events. And this has been done successfully in certain ecosystems. One of the issues is when an ecosystem is fragmented, information isn't shared across all different types of groups, and networks are closed off from each other. So it becomes difficult as an individual to navigate it when you don't know what you don't know. So then the onus has to be on those organizations who need to be in communication with each other to create events and to create spaces that allow women especially to feel welcome despite what part of the city that they might generally be in and live in and work in.
Just one thought, sort of from my perspective at the ground level here. I think I like to think of sort of the employees that we get the opportunity to work with or hire, various startups I've worked at as future entrepreneurs. So I think making sure that, the entry-level engineers, senior-level engineers, various people that we get to hire, really trying to make sure that that team is diverse and working very hard to do that, and making personal commitments to their professional development. I think that is the next generation of entrepreneurs, and by sort of giving them an opportunity to really develop in a diverse environment and supportive one. I think that in the long term, it's not a short-term solution perhaps, but in the long term, I think that that helps with some of the challenges, right? And as we see more successful female entrepreneurs moving on to become investors, and making investments in turn for female entrepreneurs. So not an immediate solution, but perhaps for the long term.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that women face in the startup ecosystem. We've kind of alluded to this a little bit, is when it comes to power dynamics, right? There's often a power imbalance when it comes to, or I should say a perceived power imbalance, especially when it comes to investment, right? Between entrepreneurs and investors. I think that kind of goes in general, but it's especially true for women. So what are some of the things that we can think about to kind of level the playing field a little bit in terms of making sure that women can see themselves, in terms of leaders, but also being able to kind of own the room and being able to present themselves in the best possible light? Are there certain things that you've seen, Lisa, from talking to people, or Ali or Banu? How can we create spaces that really support women in being able to be the amazing leaders that they are?
I've actually had many conversations about that with female founders. And, as we look at the data, there appears to be no shortage of capital. And what there is a shortage of is great places to invest that capital. The amount of money that's been pouring into private investing funds, whether that's venture capital or private equity, just is growing explosively. So this notion that as a founder and as a female founder, where the historical data points to your being able to deliver a more favorable return, should, in theory, put you in a better position to look for capital. And whether women are more capital efficient because they have to be, or because they're better managers, I mean, that's still an open question. We don't have enough data points to really answer that. But shifting that perspective a little bit and saying that you as a founder are looking for a partner. You're not a supplicant. Design the investor who you want, who's going to be a partner and a champion. And oh, by the way, you're providing the investor with an opportunity to back your company. Investors know, early stage investors know, that there is no guarantee that they're going to make a lot of money or that they're going to make any money. So I believe that that can be a really powerful way to shift the power dynamic, to say that investors are in it for the learning experience, for the relationship building, and not just to be a taskmaster.
Yeah, and I'd add to that that's an opportunity also for the community and the support organization to really take that on and think about how we are all designing our programs and how we are supporting our founders. I know, for us, for the fellowship, one of the biggest learnings that we had from the last couple of years that we instituted in this year was two things. One was leadership coaching, making sure that, that those dialogues and the founders being able to see themselves not as supplicants, right, but as equal partners, that they had the confidence and the tools and the language to be able to internalize that and then radiate that, right? That it's one thing to have a great idea and to create a great company, but if you don't see yourself as a leader, then where is the company going to go, right? And so that's really important. But it's also making me think about the human aspect of leveling the playing field by creating different kinds of relationships. So one of the pitch So we had never done a pitch event, but we decided last year to do one, but slightly differently. And one of the things we asked all of the fellows was when they were pitching to be introduced by a champion. So to have, and we worked with them to make sure they had the right champion, but to have, before they talked about their company, and by the way, they had recorded pitches already so that had been sent out. So there was less pressure on the day to perform and to be, to kind of like have that pressure on. And we asked them to bring a champion because we wanted, them to feel like there was somebody there who had their back, but also for the community to get a different perspective on that entrepreneur. So there are ways of designing events or programs where you can create those relationships ahead of time rather than keep putting people under these really high pressure situations that are super unnecessary, right? Standing in front of a big stage in front of 1,000 people and investors for the first time and having to deliver something that's supposed to be perfect, that is nerve-wracking. Like, I'm getting anxious just thinking about it, So what are some things we can do to also make sure that we are tailoring this for normal people, who are leading companies? And Ali, tell me a little bit about what that experience is like for you. What are some of the things that you've had to go through, basically playing the game? We talk about this a little bit, right? There's some things that we can do to adapt to what the current landscape is and what the community offers and the investment. But there's also structural issues with how this is all being played out, right? The investment, the capital, the way accelerators are created, the way we select people, all of those things. Tell me a little bit, Ali, about what your experience is of that.
Yeah, so I think you actually just raised my blood pressure a little bit describing that pitch event. So yeah, one of the big learnings for me in the last 2 rounds of fundraising for Alloy has been that there's really 2 distinct processes. And one happens before you start fundraising, and that's the networking, that's the intros. That's the, getting connected, getting your name out there as much as you can, communicating some of your information, some of your ideas, some of the concept, who you're working with, in order to just sort of proliferate into and expand your network. I really loved the opportunity to tell an investor that, no, we're not fundraising right now, but I'd love to do an intro. And then you get a Zoom call, it's 20 or 30 minutes. You're lucky, and it's a much less formal, you're not pitching, your standard deck. You have some visuals, and you get to have a conversation, and there's a little bit more feedback. In any way that you can do that and get to that sort of opportunity and that type of introduction well in advance of when you need to start fundraising, I thought was just much easier. Also, understanding the pattern for the content for fundraising, right? There's a standard set of slides, understanding how other founders, particularly very confident male founders, might communicate the content and how bold their claims might be. There is a component of fundraising of theater, and I think it's really important to just understand how other entrepreneurs are navigating this before you determine where you fit and where your story and your idea and how it should be communicated. So sort of understanding the game before you decide exactly what's the right fit for you in terms of how you'll play the game. But yeah, I think definitely those intros, perhaps one of the silver linings of COVID, if there were any, was, you're in your slippers on Zoom, and you can be in a situation where you feel personally comfortable, and hopefully getting to those intros through accelerators or incubators or whatever you have access to in your personal network.
So one of the big challenges that has been discussed, I'd love to get all of your thoughts on. One of the challenges that female founders do face is when this processes happens, right? Especially when it's around fundraising and around kind of like being out there and networking and all of those things, is that women tend to be asked slightly different questions, and so there's already a preset kind of bias that comes in where the promotional questions versus preventative questions. Now, when people talk about promotional questions, they're questions that help the founder talk about their vision, how big this can be, the opportunity. And preventative questions tend to be asking them about how they're going to stop the business from going under, how they're going to make sure that nothing bad happens. Right? They're questions you're allowed to kind of be can present this grand vision versus questions that kind of, put you in this kind of little corner and reductive mode. Now, I'd love some perspectives on that. It's very difficult to recognize those in the moment often, right? When you're being asked those kinds of questions that male founders typically do not get asked. And so I'd love to hear from all of you, either examples of that or things that you feel like female founders can think about, or tips to be able to address those. It's a very delicate topic, but it is a real challenge, but it's also a real opportunity for the founders, for the community, for the people they're talking to. So I'd love some perspective on that. Banu, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'll give two perspectives. One is on the founder side of like, what can you do? And one obviously is practice and get feedback, and practice sort of the negative scenarios of being asked those literal preventative questions that will boil your blood. But when it happens in real life, you'll know how you should react and how you should answer and respond back. There's also training available that Professor Donna Kanzi in London, who co-authored that prevention promotion paper. Her colleagues and her actually provide trainings to be able to recognize and respond. But I think on the investor side, what's really missing is, for a field that's concerned about returns, they're very inefficient about the ways in which they go about investing, which is the due diligence is very structured, but when you get to presentations and pitching, there's a little bit of loosey-goosiness that happens, even if people tell you that they have interview protocols for the kinds of questions that they're going to be asking. They tend to deviate from that, and they deviate based on sort of assumptions about who you are, your competency, and your ability to lead the startup. And a lot of times that's based on gender, race, and other sort of sometimes invisible dimensions that sort of trigger these assumptions in people about whether or not you can be trusted with a particular amount of money. So I think from the investor side, it's well worth noting that their interview protocols or sort of engagement protocols for pitch competitions or any sort of area where they're going to solicit some information from an entrepreneur need to be much more, I would say, clear cut and defined, and so that they're actually asking the same types of questions across the board, rather than going with that awful gut feeling of this is a great fit or this is not a good fit, because it is hard to overcome someone else's gut feeling at the end of the day, right? And so be prepared if you're a founder, but also as an investor, actually have a robust protocol that you continue to use rather than trying to go with only a gut feeling.
A perspective on this is, why don't we break away from the pitch process? Because it creates a lot of stress on the part of founders. And I have to say, I find sometimes the pitches are so well rehearsed and the founders put so much focus into the pitch that I actually don't feel like I'm getting a real sense for who the founder is or even what the company does. We've all seen that. Hello, I am so and so. We're solving the problem of X, and this is and then name the floor, billion-dollar market or LTV CAC, all of that. So why not break away? And Ali, you said something about that. Just having those conversations broken free of pitches. So that's one question. And then the other thing is, thinking about this topic made me wonder, how do other domains function? So we've seen the dismal funding numbers for women, with less than 3% of venture capital dollars going to female-founded companies. But how does it work in other domains? And then the other thing is, VC decision makers, depending on the study you look at, it's 5 to 10% of VC decision makers. But within the corporate world, there was a Deloitte study that recently came out that said that more than a quarter of traditional C-suite executives are female. So the corporate world is ahead of the VC world by quite a bit. And the rules of the game there are a little bit different. It's a much longer timeline where you can prove yourself. You're not just one person all on your own, representing the company and painting the picture and creating the vision. So I think that there are a lot of things that we can learn from other domains and break the mold of, the sort of Shark Tank archetype of how early stage funding works.
Yes, Shark Tank is the worst. At least from that perspective of like performative, kind of that performative aspect element of pitching, which is really, it's not something that we're all born with, right? So definitely I hear that. But I'm actually going to turn it over a little bit, like Ali, Banu, and Lisa. What are some of the things that you really want to make sure some of the people attending today walk away with when it comes to challenges and opportunity for female entrepreneurs? I know, Ali, obviously you've been through doing it yourself, and Lisa, you've spoken to a lot of people, and Banu, you've got all of that great kind of overview of what's happening. What are some of the, and it can be like very, very practical tips to kind of, general, kind of more general, but what are some things you want to make sure that everybody listening now walks away with thinking about for their own journeys? And Ali, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Great. A few tidbits here and there certainly learned in terms of, the hard questions, as many conversations as you can have with investors so that you get to know the questions do start to fall into a pattern, working with your team to make sure that you have clear, concise answers to those questions. Whenever you are pitching or going to be in front of more than one investor, if you have a teammate there with you. Even if you're going to do 95% of the talking, just when you get that one tough, question, and you really don't, it's really nice to just be able to divert to someone else who's been sitting there listening and, hopefully can carry the conversation for a little bit while you, regain your senses and are able to move on. I also found that, it's really about getting your name out there and having as many conversations as you can early in the process to practice that, but also just not focusing on even the lead investors early on. It's okay to talk to investors that are further outside that might not invest in, maybe you don't match their portfolio quite perfectly. Oftentimes, if you do a good job, you can get a recommendation to someone who might be a better fit. So it really gets the ball rolling. But yeah, just some ideas.
If I can share, Ali is an expert in being an entrepreneur and a very successful founder. The research I do kind of puts me in a different part where I want to tell those folks who are starting companies and who have started a company with those that they know well, tight-knit group, and the diversity isn't there. And in my conversations, what I found is every single startup founder that I spoke to values diversity, all the males, all the females. And what happens with the males is they value it, but if you go and check back on their company in 1, 2, 3 years, they really haven't done anything with it. So their company has grown and scaled, but the majority of people look similar to that initial founding team. And so what I found was that diversity, the flip side of that was trust. That while they said diversity was very important, that they weren't willing to trust people to leave the business as they would. So they kept recruiting from their networks. And so they ended up with folks that they could trust, but who were not as diverse. And at the end of the day, when you're building for a changing demographic, diversity is actually an economic asset to have. So for me, it's about thinking through that diversity isn't something you do later as you grow. You do that as you're starting, because if you grow without diversity, it's very hard to fix that. It's very hard to undo the systems, the norms, and culture of an organization and create diversity, as we've seen multiple cases of it not working in various different contexts in corporations where they try to do it and it takes a very long time. So in Boston, we're very established as an ecosystem, so we have work to do, but young and new startups don't have to follow in that same trajectory.
Great point.
It's interesting. Ali, you talked about the experience of being a founder and some of the community dynamics. Banu, you took it to a macro level. And so I'm going to answer your question, Marie, at the individual micro level. And that is, it's all about the relationships, but I really believe we all have to get out there and just talk about what we're doing. Be a woman who is interested in the capital markets. Be a man who is interested in female founders. So I'll give one example. I have been invited uh, over, let's see, it started maybe 5 or 6 years ago to be a guest lecturer at an entrepreneurial finance class to talk about remote investing. So I spent, 50% of the time talking about remote investing, but then I just made an abrupt swerve and started talking about gender imbalance in how capital is allocated. Well, over those past 5 years, what's really remarkable is I was over here, the class was over here, but we've kind of converged. So just by bringing up the topic, it's suddenly become really central to the discussion. And so get out there and talk about your experience. And then the other observation at the individual level is that female founders are really inspiring. And if you approach this path believing that you have a lot to give, then that can really change that power dynamic we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Ali had mentioned when we were talking before we got onto this call was this idea that there's a secret society of past founders and CEO, right, Ali? That there's plenty of people, and we see this all the time with some of the fellows that have gone on to raise or have gone on to do other things. Is there is an absolute want to be able to support the next generation, and that you are absolutely welcome, more than welcome, to reach out to any of those CEOs, any of those founders, anybody who's done it in the past. And I know all the women on this call would raise their hand if you said, hey, can I just pick your brain for a few minutes? Of course, right? There's a lot of people out there who really want to see this change. And you as a founder definitely have, to Lisa's point, the power to continue that conversation in your own way. Right. And that could be by, the recruiting that you do, the speaking that hopefully you are able to share the next generation of founders, what you put out there, this kind of stories. It's very uncomfortable for many of us to kind of put ourselves in the limelight, right? To say, here, look at me, here's what I'm doing, right? It can be very uncomfortable. But it's a really powerful tool to bring the right people to you if they understand what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what vision you have for your business. So being able to articulate all those things is going to be able to bring more opportunity to you. I mean, that's one of the beauties of, working with coaches or working with people who can support you in figuring out what that is. It's not just about, it's about how you build your business, but not just from a technical perspective, from a what you want to put out in the world, right? And what you want to see happen. So I definitely love all those comments. What and I welcome if anybody has, again, if you use the Q&A function for any questions, we're super happy to answer any, or if you want to just say, hey, this is happening to me, how do I deal with this? It can be that kind of session as well. So don't be afraid. Can we bring it back just a little bit to Boston specifically? What are some of the organizations and maybe some of the resources you've seen locally that you feel have can really support some of the founders out there as they create their companies and as they grow them? What are some of the organizations you would want to point to? Okay, open to all.
I'm admittedly biased, but TCN, I've had few people just in the last week tell me TCN is doing something different than what other organizations are doing. And the interesting thing is Boston and Massachusetts is not a bad place to be a female founder. The amount of capital going to women in the Boston area is about double the national average, but it's still really tiny. But we're also seeing, much higher levels of capital going to women in New York and California. But so this actually is there are resources, and it's not a bad community to be a woman. But again, I'll point to TCN for all the reasons that you mentioned, Marie, which is emphasis on a cohort, emphasis on the tools and tactics, but also the mindset that will help women succeed in the world of fundraising.
Ali, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think, my own journey probably has, a specific path. And I think there's a lot of resources out there that might be a fit depending on what type of company and, what type of founder you are. So the Capital Network has also been very helpful to me over the years.
Thanks, guys.
Learned quite a bit. Like I mentioned, grant programs, Mass CEC, NYSERDA, Mass Tech, Mass Ventures, the National Science Foundation is fantastic. Basic requirement that it has to be a new technology or novel technology that can be commercialized. So very open-ended, quite a bit of work to apply, but a lot of the work that you would do to form your company anyways and build your business plan or commercialization plan. So, and I have had a great opportunity and many engagements with Greentown Labs as sort of my accelerator of choice. But I think there's one out there for every founder, a network to become part of. I'd also, just in the avenue of getting stuck in the feedback and mentorship loop, there's a lot of accelerators and incubators out there, and you don't need to be part of all of them. So they can take quite a bit of work. And if you need the help and guidance and connections and network, that's great and a good way to leverage that. But there are more out there than you have time to potentially participate in. So, using those opportunities and leveraging those opportunities wisely and your time wisely, I think is really important.
Okay, so I'm back on, which means there's only a few minutes left. Do you guys want to have?
We're just rounding it out. Yeah, we're rounding it out. So Banu, go ahead.
So Innovation Women, which was started by Bobby Carlton and Betsy Dupre, which is a platform to bring visibility to women as speakers and experts across a variety of domains. They run innovation nights as well, which instead of a pitch, it's a community-based sort of decision on which of the pitches should move forward with potential funding and sort of other opportunities. There are, as Ali mentioned, a number of incubators and accelerators, but within those there are, I would say, individuals rather than necessarily programs that support people. There is some wonderful community in the Roxbury Innovation Center. Malia Lazu is a leader in sort of thinking about inclusion and the innovation economy. So I would suggest that folks interested, folks that reach out to her. She's at MIT right now. I think that's really important. There are other individuals, but I'm happy to share more. And I know the TCN folks, we work together quite a bit. Like you have been putting together resources for female founders and others in the New Majority group who are able to take advantage of sort of the different things that are happening in and around town. I have a lot more people I could name, but I know we're sort of running out of time. So I just, in my shameless plug, I'll put a book that I have coming. It's co-authored with a colleague, and Boston is featured prominently for some of the things that it's doing right, but also some of the things it needs to do better.
Awesome. Yeah, there's definitely lots of great organization. Optima Bootcamp is another one for early stage Black and Brown founders that does some great work. There's lots of organizations. It's just a case of really finding the right fit for you. I will say you don't need to go through an accelerator. Just because you didn't accept it to one doesn't mean you don't have a fantastic, company, and you can still get the help that you need without that. But you do have to make sure that you reach out to any of us and ask. My motto is don't ask, don't get. And it's very useful. It's a very useful motto in this kind of ecosystem. So just wanted to say a big thank you to Lisa Frustraya, to Ali Forsyth, and to Banu Oskazapan for joining us today. And really, there's so much to talk about. We could be here for another 5 hours just on this very subject. But thank you for just bringing some of these things to light. And I'm going to hand it back over to James.
Yes. So thank you, Banu. Thank you, Lisa and Ali. And thank you, Marie. It was a great session. So we have more content over the course of the week. So everyone, please come back and check it out. So again, thank you all, and we'll see you later.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.